Mark and Torin Finser, welcome to the Three Brothers Quest. Wonderful to
Thank
have
you.
you. We're
Thank
here to
you,
talk
Pat.
today about Rudolf Steiner. And let's maybe begin by each of you maybe taking a few moments to explain how you discovered the work of Rudolf Steiner, who is a towering figure in the world of both science and, shall we say, mysticism.
That's a bit of an unfair question, given that we kind of were born into it,
Do
you know,
tell.
be- because of the multi-generations. It's not only our parents who on both sides had been our students of Rudolf Steiner, and my father and our father is still alive and still a student of Steiner's work, and but his parents and our mother's parents. So it's a really fascinating thing to. I often have been jealous of those who had their own journey and then found Rudolf Steiner sort of in their 20s or 30s, and so that part of it was a discovery different from my brother and mine, but I would say my waking up to Rudolf Steiner was sort of in already in my high school years. I found myself wondering, or even a little bit earlier than that, I found myself wondering this education, which we both had in Waldorf education, who is this man behind this work? And so I actually asked one of my teachers to start a study group in my senior year in high school.
In high school.
In high school. And
That's
so
amazing.
we had on Friday nights we had a study group, and then afterwards we all went out and partied. So it was a win-win for everybody.
I think Steiner might have been pleased.
Yes. The thing for me though was this remarkable sense of this human being that I very quickly saw was a bridge from ancient traditions, from all the traditions that we know about in the world through the world history, a lot from the East that were coming from the East, and for me, in the 70s was just waking up to how the West was waking up to Buddhism and other traditions from the East, and therefore Steiner, for me, was that bridge to begin to articulate those ancient understandings to a Western consciousness that he saw would be emerging more and more in our time, and we can see it long after his death now, of people waking up to their own inner quest and their own sense of their where do I come from, and how do I explain those events that are happening in my life? So it's that bridge, but it's also the creation of a new understanding of spirituality and a bridge of spirituality down into practical things. So it wasn't just kept on the level of the intellect, but all the way down through our feeling life and into our actions, into actual practical application.
Mm. Beautifully said, Mark. Torin, anything to add to how you both came across and discovered Steiner?
Well, my path was very different than Mark's. While,
Ah,
while he was in a high school, Green Meadow, that supported this study group, I went to the local public high school. And then when I went off to Bowdoin College, I also had no interest or connection. And so I was really 21 before an incident occurred that helped me wake up to Rudolf Steiner on my own rather than seeing some books on the shelves of our parents' home all those years. And the incident was needing to take one more elective at Bowdoin College. And I decided to do a philosophy course, something different. And it was on the mind-body problem. And it really left me non-pulse. I sat through the debates and the presentations, and it was very hard for me to connect. And then the professor announced that most of the grade would be based on a final paper that we had to write. And I could not think of what to write on the mind-body problem because I didn't see it as a problem. It's very hard to do that. So I went to the Longfellow Library at Bowdoin College and walked up and down the stacks, just looking at books. And suddenly I saw a little book called Philosophy of Freedom by Rudolf Steiner.
mm.
And I saw that name and I said, oh, that rings a bell. I saw that name on my parents' bookshelves. Yeah, there we
I
go.
happen to have it here. Yes. Yeah.
So I pulled it off and I started reading and realized the mind-body problem was not a problem. There was a highly articulate view of the human being as a whole,
Mm.
and that it was what I had been longing for. And in a way, the course had created a thirst in me for something different. So it served a purpose. So I went to the professor and said, I want to do my paper on that book that you just held up. And he said, well, Steiner used to be considered a philosopher, but he sort of gave up his credentials when he got involved in Waldorf education, biodynamic farming, and medicine and stuff. I don't consider him a philosopher anymore. And I said, well, I don't care what he's called. I just want to do my paper on this book. And then Professor Pulse looked at me with his steely gray eyes and he said, well, we practice academic freedom here. You can do anything you want, but I need to warn you, this guy's not a philosopher and I may not give you credit.
Wow.
And that was the best thing that could have happened to me because I went to my little study carrel at the library and I worked on that book for hours every day. And I handed in a paper very much to your question about Western traditions. I based many of Steiner's views on the history of philosophy, Aristotle, so on and so forth. And even the professor then had to either reject all of those philosophical traditions or so I got a grade and I graduated.
Well played. Well played.
I didn't know that story, Torin. That's great. I
We should
forgot
do this more often, Mark.
that.
Yeah, and I've been at the Bowdoin College. I've been in Longfellow. Our daughter was a student there, and
Oh, wow.
yeah, and that notion, I can see you there in the stacks, just working through it.
Yeah.
That's a wonderful story. Well, you mentioned just a moment ago a couple of contributions of Steiner to the human experience, but he really he's such a towering figure. And can we three of us step back for a moment and can you both kind of sketch out kind of the legacy of Steiner across disciplines before we get back into maybe his contributions to the West? Like what should we know about Steiner? This is sort of an introduction to our audience of Rudolf Steiner's work and legacy.
Yeah. For me, the beautiful thing about Steiner's work is that he describes in his own autobiography his own spiritual development and how meditative practice became so important to him and who his teachers were. But there came a moment in his 30s where the act of meditation was the equivalent of what we would normally experience as just hunger and thirst. So, right, after this call, I'll be thirsty, right? So that's the kind of equivalent that he said sort of emerged in him was a meditative life. And as a result, I think he prepared himself and he was prepared for the kinds of questions that came towards him. And it's often forgotten, even by deep students of Steiner, that so much of what emerged through his life and beyond was because someone came to him with a question.
Mm.
And so it's this quest or this question element that when you have a question, it is a deep mystery where something opens up for you. And just like you asking us questions today, right? It opens something up. We discover something new. And that was to me a sort of his methodology. Some people think, oh, he was ready just to download, someone, like Emil Molt came and said, my factory workers, he was a businessman, and my factory workers are craving for some kind of education. And can you imagine in that time that you would have an owner of a factory that wants to have continuing ed for his workers, not for their children necessarily initially, but for their workers. And then the workers get to experience some continuing education where Steiner comes into the factory and comes in and starts teaching them about all sorts of fascinating things. And then the workers say, can we have this for our children? And so then was born Waldorf education as something for children. But it began by a question, is there something deeper? And you could go on and on. The same was in medicine with Dr. Ita Begman, who was a female doctor. Imagine in that time, a woman doctor partnering with someone like Rudolf Steiner to create a whole new view on medicine that was based on ancient traditions, but also took it further, took it into a place of recognizing what human beings would need today and into the future as medicine that would work in harmony with all the influences that would be coming to people from the environment and from the earth that was beginning to going to suffer more and more over time. Same with biodynamics, right? It was farmers that came to Steiner and said, "Can you give us a course on how to work differently with soil, how to work differently with the land?" Because what we're seeing coming down the road is a more pharmaceutical approach towards the land and towards soil, and just dumping pesticides, dumping nutrients in a way that is going to just create better food. But we want to look at it more holistically. We want to be healers of the soil, as well as create food that is medicine for human beings now and into the future. And Torin, you could take up some of the other ones in the arts and all of that.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, Torin, please.
Yeah, it was the same with the art of movement, eurythmy. We have several eurythmists in our family, including Mark's daughter now, Johanna.
And what does
The
that
art
what
of
does that mean?
movement, eurythmy is visible speech, visible sound. So, of course, we have the traditions of movement and ballet and other uh, um, disciplines, but the eurythmy was really created out of a view of the human being, the holistic view that Mark was describing. And then there's also the work in special education, the Camp Hill schools. I was down in Beaver Run, Pennsylvania, a year ago and experienced again how the anthroposophical insights can really help children and adults who have challenges, who have found themselves in a body that isn't able to do everything that we sometimes take for granted, mental, emotional, physical. And it was a nice little anecdote to hear from one of the coworkers down there in Camp Hill, uh, how well received they are now. And he pointed out the window, and the school buses were lined up. And I thought maybe it was taking their children to another part of the campus. It's a large village, a large farm, several hundred acres. He said, no, those are the children from local public schools. They have found that their SPED programs just are not working, and they're sending them to us for the day student experience, where they get to do weaving and pottery and music and academics, but suited for the particular situation those children find themselves in. So Camp Hill is another. I wanted to share just one quote from someone Mark and I knew very well. He was a leader in Waldorf schools and also the Anthroposophical movement. It's Henry Barnes, one of the best biographies that I know of, Life for the Spirit. And he says, page 11, as you know, I'm the academic in the family, so I have to give you page numbers. You can go and check up on me.
Impressive.
Yeah. Quote, Western humanity was losing the ability to see the inner and outer aspects of human experience as two sides of a single whole. This inability to see both the inner and outer, but as part of a whole. And that's what Mark was talking about with Waldorf education and all these other ventures. That's the common denominator, the holistic view of the human being. And now we look at, society is more fragmented than ever before. And you can't even go and get medical treatment without bouncing from one specialist to another. Very few people just look at you, and try to size you up. But if I could just go one step further with what Mark brought about the question, may I just do one more minute
Of course, yes,
on
please.
this first one? Um, what Mark was saying about the question is so important. And I've puzzled with this for a long time. Why did Rudolf Steiner always wait for the question? Because there are, of course, nonverbal ways to express a need. There are also situations where the question would not be asked. And isn't that a responsibility as well? So I've lived with this for a while, and what I realized is that the question often has within it already the seed of an answer. And the person asking the question has to be at the right place in the right time to be able to receive an answer, which was the case for Amy Molt, as Mark was describing, Carl Koenig and others, and Marie Steiner with the eurythmy. You have to be in a place where you can receive the question. And this may be verging on the next topic, but going back to Western tradition, Socrates spoke of a daemon, a wiser self. In the Middle Ages, there was the angel. Other people spoke of a cleverer self, but there's something that guides us that I think is active in asking the question. And one has to be willing to have that question asked so that that activity of the daemon or the angel or the higher self can be part of the question.
Yeah, curiosity, I think, is a much underappreciated human virtue.
Yeah.
And certainly in my own university teaching, I always encourage my students to lead with their questions, and we begin our every one of our classes with a little bit of breathing together. And then, what questions have you laid on our table?
Yeah, and I think curiosity keeps you young as well. I mean, we both see that in our father, Here he is, 92 years old. Last night he said to me, I can't believe how lucky I am to still be alive and to every day be able to explore new things.
Gosh, yeah, it is perhaps the hallmark of a lifelong learner, is that
Yeah.
propensity for curiosity. Yeah, beautifully said. And Torin, I love this notion of having to sort of prime yourself through curiosity to both ask and receive the question, the quest, as it were. Yeah. And you're right. We were anticipating the next question. This is a question from Ian Baldwin. He's wondering, how do you see Steiner fitting into the great Western occult tradition? This is Ian's question. And it probably would be important for one of you to define the word occult for our audience.
You want to do that, Mark?
No, I was hoping you would, being the
Okay.
academic.
I, well, this is not an academic matter. I actually don't like the word occult.
Fair enough.
And for my students, when we do the picture of evolution that Rudolf Steiner gives, we use the edition called esoteric science.
Hmm.
I think esoteric has a more open meaning for people. And the part of the word cult always provokes the word cult. And we have to really get away from that because Rudolf Steiner was so intent on fostering and supporting human freedom. And so a lot of damage has been done collectively to humanity by people who imposed a particular doctrine, whether in the name of religion or something else. And so Steiner was really a fighter for freedom. So I like esoteric better. Yeah, where were you going with this?
Yeah, and can we parse the word esoteric versus perhaps exoteric? Like, what does that mean, esoteric?
Your turn, Mark.
Yeah, esoteric is something that is maybe not so visible to the current senses, to our human, five senses that we know. I find it so beautiful nowadays that we're referring to social intelligences, and therefore Steiner actually articulates 12. He calls them senses back in his time, but I would say 12 intelligences. So there are multiple ways of knowing that go beyond just the five senses. And so what is esoteric over time can become exoteric. And it tends to, throughout the ages, has been often cultivated in small groups first before it becomes, part of the wider culture. So my thinking of esoteric is when it is still hidden from regular view. It doesn't mean that because it's hidden that it isn't there, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's the amazing thing, that you come across people that say, well, there's this whole spiritual piece that Steiner brings about, and he has such an articulated cosmology of a spiritual world, which is just as real as the physical world that we have now. And I have yet to come across um, such a well articulated um, cosmology of a spiritual life with anybody else than Steiner. And so when he's referred to as a spiritual scientist, that's kind of how I look at it, because it's science we know today as something that has done incredible work for understanding the physical world, right? And it's getting more and more articulate in understanding even things that we used to think were not material world. Now we've gone beyond, right? In the sense of quantum physics, we've gone beyond what we normally would think of as just the physical. But I think the next step is really to understand, and that's why I see Steiner as a scientist, to really articulate and bring out what is normally seen as esoteric, but is actually a very well articulated spiritual world that is is something that is active, whether we see it or not, and it's also something that is evolving. It is not static. It's not finished. And so that's why I said early on, I see Steiner as a bridge, because there are new mysteries being developed right now as we speak, new things. We tend to always go back to the ancient mysteries, but we today, even this conversation is contributing to something for the future as well.
Mm. Gosh, beautifully said. Tor, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, that's terrific, Mark. At a moment like this one, my inclination is to want to pause and have a little time to reflect. Just so I'm going to tell a story which brings out a different aspect. Mark already spoke beautifully to the one aspect, and a story often allows one to sort of sink in a little bit. Like my Longfellow library story.
You're such a good teacher, Torin.
Well, it's incurable, just I'll take it to my grave. So this goes now to a course I've taught many times at Antioch University. The public school folks who take it's called History and Philosophy of Education. And for the Waldorf people, it's Evolving Consciousness. So I've taught it to different audiences. And it's really to Ian's question in a way, and please thank him for contributing this. This whole this arc of Western traditions. It's very important to me that our teachers today not see Steiner as sort of this isolated individual, and it's sort of my way or the highway, but they can really do what Steiner did, which was immerse themselves in the whole panorama. I mean, Steiner was really well versed in many other philosophers and many other traditions. So what we did in this course is that in addition to the usual stuff one has to teach it, I asked each student in September to adopt a philosopher or spiritual leader that they would work with for 4 months. So one person would sign up for Aristotle, another for Plato, another for Thomas Aquinas. We had some doing more recent people, Paulo Freire, Ivan Illich, Amos Comenius, the whole gamut. So imagine a room then in December
Mm.
after they have immersed themselves in the thinking and the philosophy and the spiritual practices of their individual person. Then we have had a series of philosophical conversations. And I would ask a question such as, how does your philosopher relate to the panorama of Western, or what is unique? What did you contribute that you hope humanity can carry forward? And they would speak to one another. They would sometimes disagree, which was really great. We would have a B.F. Skinner in the room, or
Mhm.
someone like that, behavior management kind of thing. And those conversations were amazing. And the reason I brought it out, I'm telling you this story, sometimes they even came in costume. Sylvia Ashton Warner came in with a bottle of favorite wine, things like that. Um, the reason I'm bringing it here in this conversation is after really going deeply into their own person, they realized that there was a universe of connection, that Aristotle said things that can be found directly in Rudolf Steiner's work. Amos Comenius, Mark's piece about the senses, his Pan Sophia, working out of the senses, he even had them do main lesson books, the way Waldorf does. Suddenly, you realize that this is a company of remarkable women and men
Mm,
who collectively have brought us to a certain place.
mm.
And then sometimes one of my students dares to be Rudolf Steiner. And it's very interesting to watch that person who is portraying Rudolf Steiner in the philosophical conversations, how Rudolf Steiner fits. But they come out of it with a sense of the whole. But also, parents have then told me that the graduates from Antioch are able to relate more readily to parents coming from different philosophical traditions because they've learned to listen to different viewpoints and see the horizon and not just the individual trees.
And this seems to me to be one of Steiner's great attributes as an individual is his ability to really dive deeply into other ways of feeling and thinking that he didn't necessarily agree with,
Right.
but he was trying very deeply to understand. I was really struck in reading biographies of Steiner that seems to me a fairly rare quality, and he seemed to embody that. Am I right about that?
Yeah, and the Chadwick Library has just published 3 volumes of all of the bibliography of Steiner's his own library.
Wow.
You can say why. And the library itself is fascinating that he had. It is, as Torin said, it is the whole gamut. It is, and you can see where some of the books back in the day you had to cut the paper in order to read it. Some were just totally, totally worked through,
Yeah,
and other areas he didn't even touch.
yeah,
There's a
yeah.
great anecdote in one of the introductions where a student came to Steiner and said, I have so much to study, and I have all these medical books that I have to come across, and so on. And Steiner says, you have to develop spiritually so that ultimately you can go to a book and pick out the essential. You don't have to read it all. You can pick out the essential. And so his library is just a great and with areas that are totally marked up and areas that have not been read. But the breadth, and even at his on his deathbed, there were stacks of books that he was reading, until the last moment. He was reading everything that he wanted to see, whatever new author was out, whatever new thinker was out there. So that's what Torin's referring to, to be that up and be a citizen of our time.
Mm,
I have an anecdote to substantiate what Mark just said.
please.
We have a mutual friend. She's now retired from her leadership role, still lives in Dornach, Switzerland, Virginia Cease. And she tells a story of how Rudolf Steiner would give his administrative assistant some Swiss francs on Friday and ask the person to go down to the local bookstore in Basel and buy whatever was new. And that person would bring them up and set them outside Rudolf Steiner's office door. And on Monday morning, there would be a note with the books that were to be returned. Very liberal return policy. This was before Amazon and having to do shipping labels and all of that.
Yeah.
But he always kept some of them that he added to his library and others and he would return. And to be able to return a book, you have to do what Mark just said. You have to be able to find, a way through that without reading it. And that is an art form, which we all still need today, particularly with downloading from the internet. But it showed his interest in everything. And my teacher in teacher training at Adelphi University, John Gardner, always said, Steiner didn't read Steiner. You all have to read more than Steiner to appreciate what his contribution was. So I think this theme Mark and I are bringing is really important because one of the grave misunderstandings of anthroposophy and Rudolf Steiner is this kind of you belong or you don't. And what Mark and I have tried to do in our lives is to really build those bridges and show those connections.
Mm.
And Rob, it can sound very that we're just sort of in a place of incredible awe of this human being. Yes, we are, but at the same time, he was a fun-loving person as well. That's the fascinating thing. I was blessed to have a babysitter that came a few times and would when Torin, because he's 4 years older than me, and my parents went out to something, I had her, and she had Rudolf Steiner when the first Waldorf school started, and so she said that he would come to their house and he would teach her games. And so Steiner and she and the children would be on their all fours, crawling around the room, playing games, being active. He could enter into that childlike quality, which we see with great teachers as well, right? The Dalai Lama is the same. He has this childlike quality that is just catching. And so when my parents would sometimes come back, they would find the babysitter and me on the floor rolling in stitches with just laughter because of the games we had been playing and that she had learned from Steiner.
Yeah, there's a playfulness about him that I spoke to me through, my reading about him and his own approach too. I love that. That's so powerful. And just to come back really quickly to your story, Torin, about that classroom exercise with my professor hat on myself. What a beautiful way to engage students in that conversation across time and place. That's remarkable. I would have been daunted as a young student to take on Steiner
It
myself.
actually only happened a few times
Yeah,
because I was in a way bringing a lot of Steiner's ideas to the course. So they also were respectful in not wanting to sort of take up my
I
piece.
see. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, that's and
There's
please, yeah.
There's something else that maybe I should say before I forget here, which is I've had so many friends that have tried to read Rudolf Steiner and had such a hard time.
Yeah.
There's something about the way he writes, particularly his books. I would say I would advise anybody to not focus as much on his lectures, but really on his books, because those are the things that he stood behind,
Mm.
and he redid them when they were republished. They were done again and again. That's why I suggested you look at How to Know Higher Worlds. There were multiple editions where he continued to evolve and try and articulate things better and better and better. But there's something in the way he writes, and the German speaking people, even because it was all in German originally, right? So there are German people who are classical academics can't stand the way he writes because they say it's all backwards because he puts things in a different sentence structure than what we normally do in German even. But I have come to recognize that it's actually done on purpose, and it's actually done so that as the very act of reading creates new neurons in our brain and creates new pathways for opening up to something that is beyond the material world. And I've had people say, I was reading and I tried and I tried, and then suddenly one day, boom, I could suddenly read everything.
Wow.
It would put me to sleep. And so I think there's something in there's a mystery where the very act of effort, because it takes effort, and we're not used to that nowadays. We're used to being spoon-fed, right? It's kind of a situation where we just would like to have it all fed to us, as opposed to use our own will to engage in something that is not necessarily easy, but through that effort, a new muscle is created. That is a neural pathway for us to wake up to something different.
That's a remarkable insight, Mark. How to Know Multiple Worlds is the book that you've recommended. Yes.
I don't know higher worlds.
Sorry, How to Know Higher Worlds. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Just for those listening who, just to flag that. Yeah. If they wanted
That
to
was
read.
that was my entry. I know Philosophy of Freedom was also helped me through college as well. I kind of was depressed during college because I was not an academic and I didn't really enjoy school that much. I'm more the entrepreneur. I like doing things, but it was reading a paragraph. This maybe sound a little bit kooky, but I would literally light a candle in the evening and then read a couple of paragraphs of Philosophy of Freedom. But early on, it was How to Know Higher Worlds because that book starts with there slumbers in each human being the capacity to know higher worlds, to know other.
Wow.
So the idea that something is slumbering, the
Yes.
idea that these chakras within us are there, but they're in rudimentary form, and it takes work to have those chakras, to have those lotus blossoms actually fully come out and fully
Yes.
develop in each of us.
Emerge, those lotus emerge through the muck and the mire. Wow. What a beautiful, is that a Steiner quotation?
Yes,
Wow.
it's in his book, How to Know
Okay.
Higher.
How to Know Higher Worlds. All right. I've read The Philosophy of Freedom, so that'll be my next read for Steiner. Um, do you want to jump in, Torin? I had another question, but please.
Yeah, just to add to what Mark said, that is true. And there's some people who are not fortunate to find their book, their knowledge of higher worlds, or their philosophy of freedom.
Mm.
And I think we have a responsibility to keep as many doors and windows open as possible.
Yes. Yes.
Um, and so, for example, I had many students come to me saying, as Mark just described, I can't get into this. It's too much. I can't read this whole book, and then confused with different translations and so on. And so, at my students' request, here we go with the question again, Mark. The students asked, Torin, is there some way where you could take excerpts from these basic books and put them together?
Yeah.
And that's why I did, guided self-study. So
Mm.
it has Mark's book in there, Knowledge of Higher Worlds. It has your book, Rob. Uh, but I took the liberty of renaming How to Attain Knowledge of Higher Worlds. That's already a mouthful. In my version, I call it the Book of Peace. And there's a section. And then Rob, yours is the Book of Freedom.
Ah,
So each of his basic books,
yeah.
I have a section, but then I wanted to show that we're living in today, and this is not just a historical document. So what I did is, after a few of these juicy paragraphs that Mark was describing, we can just live with a paragraph for a long, long time. I ask a question for the reader to think about. So
I love that.
talking about the feeling life and the sentient soul and all of that after that section,
Yeah.
my question to the reader is, have you seen a movie lately in which this played out?
Mm.
Now, that wasn't a question that Steiner would have asked.
Yeah.
The movie industry was not where it is today. It didn't even
Basics.
exist as far
Basics.
as I know. But so I'm just adding to what Mark brought, that we also need to give many opportunities for people to find their own way, and respect that people will find their way if given opportunities.
Yeah, Torin, and that's why I'm so grateful for your effort and all that you've done as an author to write these books and to really take the work that you've done through a lifetime and then translate it into something that is then also a new doorway for people and for your students, for others. So, that's I've always been in awe of that part of what you've managed to achieve.
Thank you, Mark.
Can you both say just a few words about anthroposophy?
Yeah, it's a mouthful, isn't it?
It
Right? A
sure
lot of
is.
people stumble over it. I tell them they have to take a running leap at it in order to even say it. But at the same time, it has anthropos in it, right, which is the human being,
Yes.
and it has Sophia, which is wisdom.
Yes.
So it's really the wisdom of the human being, and I think that is such a beautiful made up word that will become more and more prevalent because after all, who can argue with trying to understand the wisdom of the human being? And through the wisdom of the human being, you also understand the wisdom of all sentient beings, of all living beings, and of the whole earth and its connection. So I think anthroposophy as a word is still yet to be more widely known. I actually more and more refer to that word than just Rudolf Steiner, because I don't necessarily think it's attached to. I mean, Steiner's evolved since his death. I'm sure he's in a different dynamic as well.
Yeah.
And so just referring back to that being and that person in that lifetime. Whereas anthroposophy actually, I think, has a being quality to it, which is continuing to grow and also help people understand what the wisdom is in this remarkable thing it is to be a human today. And so anyway, that's one thought there. One last thought there is that at the end of Steiner's life, he gave some lectures called Anthroposophy and Introduction, way at the end of his life in 1924. And in those lectures, he actually says, in some ways, he wished he could have come up with a new name, quite regularly. He didn't want anything to get fixed. So even anthroposophy, the word anthroposophy should not get fixed. That's why Torin is, with his books, is writing something in a way that gives new names to things and
Yes.
new questions, because he didn't want people to get fixed. He said the only problem with that is that we would have no frame of reference, right? If today I was not Mark, but I was Rob, it would be awkward, right? It would be, oh, who did you have? Who did you have on your podcast? Oh, it was Rob. It was not Mark. Mark was yesterday. But there's something there's something about a name that gives us a frame of reference, but it should not stay fixed.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I love that. Torin, what would you say about anthroposophy?
Yeah, I'm just going to say ditto to everything Mark said. That was perfect. And so I'm not going to try that response because it worked. What I would just like to tease out a little bit more is what Mark ended with, anthroposophy and Rudolf Steiner, that the value of anthroposophy is it's a path of inquiry. And I always try to get my students at Antioch and Center for Anthroposophy in this mode of using anthroposophy as a method to inquire, to learn, rather than seeing it as a philosophy, a noun that sits on your shelf.
Yes.
So anthroposophy, a path of inquiry, a method, and then we use it in our research, of course. What does it mean to use the lenses, of anthroposophy to see the world perhaps more deeply than one would otherwise? The other piece with Rudolf Steiner is he was very much a man in his time. And I think, as Mark said, much that he did would in 2024 have a different look. It would be different.
Yeah.
And I'm reinforced in that view because he, as you know, started the first Waldorf school in 1919, and 5 years later, he was asked by some of the teachers, now you have this curriculum. If you were starting it today, would you do anything different? And he said, of course. And he had a whole list of things he would do differently
Yeah.
in 5 years.
Yes.
So now it's been over 100 years. We have to really imagine that. So that's why I'm so intent in supporting these ventures that Mark described, because I think the biodynamic farmers, the Waldorf teachers, the Camp Hill workers in special education, they are on the cutting edge of always modernizing anthroposophy.
Yeah. The thing that's to me, Rob, is still a mystery is why he is not as well, or even anthroposophy is not as well known. It is still relatively unknown, and yet if you actually look to all who have been touched by it, it's in the millions. It's millions and millions. If you think of even the consumers of a Weleda product or Dr. Hauschka, this all comes out of Steiner's insights and anthroposophy. And so or the banking world, right? I mean, I've been involved in social finance and new ethical banking. There's a whole banking dimension. And he brings up banking. Where does he bring it up? He brings up when he's trying to bring insight into one of the Gospels, the Gospel of St. John. I mean, it's like he talks about banking there, right? So to me, it's just fascinating that it is still, it's almost like there is a little bit of a blanket over some of this work that has not yet fully broken through, and maybe it will take another 1,000 years, right? It took a long time for yoga, for example, to be fully appreciated in the West,
Mm.
even though it had been practiced for so long in Eastern traditions.
Mm.
So maybe it will take that much longer. But as Torin says, it will look very different, in 1,000 years as well. So to me, that's the mystery, is that probably your audience does not realize that there are so many touch points that actually anthroposophy has reached out to, which is quite, the biodynamic whole Demeter in Europe, that's all originally from the even the origins of the organic movement really
Yeah.
started with biodynamics, or the
Yeah, that's true.
environmental movement with Rachel Carson. I mean, it just goes on and on.
Yeah. Yeah, beautifully said. Well, let's end with one more question. I would love to get both of your reactions to something that Steiner biographer A.P. Shepard writes. He says this, summarizing Steiner: the secret of the future lies in the transformation of man by his rediscovery of himself. The secret of the future lies in the transformation of man by his rediscovery of himself. How do we, as humans, rediscover ourselves at this moment? It's a very unique moment, I think, for Team Human, as I like to call us, Homo sapiens. How do we rediscover ourselves in this moment? Maybe tapping into Steiner's wisdom. What would you both have to say?
Maybe I'll start, and Torin, you can have the last word. First of all, I would change the word man to the human being, because I think the danger that we have today is that we just think of more of the masculine when we hear man, but that's not what he was referring to as when he said man. So I'd say it's the human being, and I think the rediscovery of the human being is part of an evolution whereby we had a time where the human being did nothing without consulting an oracle, or without consulting their teacher, or without consulting their master.
Mm.
There was an age and a time where the human being was completely unfree. And then there was an evolution of the human being that Steiner articulates very beautifully, which is, in order to develop freedom, the human being had to separate from that and had to actually go through a darkness of the soul whereby they were completely alone and felt completely alone. And many still today feel completely alone, and even more so with technology, and completely isolated. However, yeah, ironically. However, we're at a time where, and I think anthroposophy can help so beautifully, is we're at a time where the human being can recognize that they are not alone, and they can actually rediscover their origins by reconnecting to their spiritual origins, by doing the work of recognizing that what comes towards them out of the future,
Mm.
what comes towards them from their fellow human beings, from every situation in life that you meet, is actually a moment to rediscover yourself.
Mm.
That socially, in our communities and in our local communities and on a national basis and internationally, we are about rediscovering ourselves and rediscovering what it means to be truly human.
Wow. Thanks, Mark. Torin?
Yeah, that sounded like last words to me, Mark.
Those were my last words. Now it's your last words.
We could turn off the recording at this point and call it the last words. Yeah, it's hard to add to that. Maybe I have two words. The word nothingness and the second word is metamorphosis.
Mm.
The word nothingness is, I think, part of what we're going through right now as society is coming up to kind of an abyss
Mm.
where so much that has worked before is not working. And some people respond out of anger.
Mm.
Some people respond by retreating.
Mm.
Some people try to ignore the realities. But there is a kind of experience of nothingness, of an abyss. And now, in this moment where so much of the old support is taken away, the old traditions, we're really thrown back upon ourselves, and we have to rediscover. We have to find a new basis to go forward. The prevalence that we see in schools of suicide ideation is a kind of an abyss.
Mm.
The breakdown that we live down the road from some elderly people who are in subsidized apartments, the loneliness
Mm.
that I experience,
Mm.
and how they respond when they're sitting on their bench and I say, good morning, or I wave to them. It's like nobody has done that in the whole day.
Mm.
So many manifestations of this nothingness, of this abyss.
Mm.
And I think out of that, we have to find a very new way, as Mark was describing, out of freedom, not because the priest told us or the rabbi or, the wise teacher. We have to find a new way out. So that was the word nothingness. The second word, a little bit more uplifting perhaps, is metamorphosis. And there are many ways to talk about that. Mark and my father and I in particular have a love for fruit trees, berry bushes, all things that lives and grows. We each of us have gardens, and when I go out in my backyard, and each plant, each tree has a message for me. There's I have a relationship to each one because I've planted most of them. So the clump of birch that my son Thomas gave me, they were just tiny, and to watch the changes that have occurred to the point now where it's tall and the bark was sort of a light brown and now it's turning white and now the bark is starting to peel as a birch tree would. To really live into the metamorphosis of natural phenomena is a schooling in phenomenology that can also be used for the human being, and to sort of rediscover oneself, stimulated by first the experience of the abyss, but also stimulated by a kind of environmentalism in which nature becomes our teacher, not a person, but nature becomes our teacher. And just to spend some time with my clump birch, for me, helps me rediscover. And I go back into my next Zoom meeting up in my den here where you see me, a different person if I've done that well. And I think that's something that we need to support each other as humans all over to both recognize the abyss and recognize the pathways. And one of them I'm just describing is the developmental approach or the metamorphosis that is possible. So that's just two pieces there at the end that I think speak to our time.
Wow, beautifully said, Torin. Well, Mark and Torin Finser, it has been a pleasure. And
Likewise, Rob. Really a
thank you.
pleasure to meet you this way.
Yes, and thanks to the three Baldwin brothers, Michael and Ian and Philip Baldwin, as well as the Marian Institute, for their support of this ongoing conversational series, The Three Brothers Quest. And gentlemen, I hope we have a chance to do this again, perhaps in the new year.
Great.
And,
Wonderful.
until then, wishing you both well, and hope to see you again soon.
All right.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you
Bye-bye.
so much.
Welcome to the Requesting Room. We are here with the Baldwin brothers, Michael and Philip and Ian, to reflect on our conversation about Rudolf Steiner with the Finser brothers. Gentlemen, welcome.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Good to be here again.
Good to see you all. So what did you make of the Finsers?
Well, I think we've all weighed in on the fact that it's probably one of the most delightful interviews we've done yet. I think it's great fun to see a pair of people responding so easily. It's extraordinary, their ability to answer those questions in this back and forth kind of way, with each of them adding, I think, so many sort of nuggets to the answers. I also, what really the thing I wanted to personally bring up was, of course, I love this spiritually sensitive nature of Steiner. And given the people that we have already interviewed, not all of them, but some of them, like Anna Rytort, one of the things that I find fascinating is, again, the indication that we are all mystics, that we have this spiritual sensitivity, which Steiner evidently felt and experienced right off the bat as a young person, as I understand the stuff that we've read, and so it reminds me of the the ability to sort of achieve enlightenment or greater awareness, which this wonderful philosophy that Enna brings to our attention, called Farak in Bengal, and how to awaken this mysticism in each of us. And of course, it's so important, I believe, from what we understand, that it's totally related to nature. And it makes me even think of the Buddha, who went through so many sort of tortuous paths to try to find enlightenment, and finally sort of threw up his hands and said, I'm going to sit under this bloody tree, and it's going to come or it's not going to come. And it makes me sort of believe that the connection with the tree and just sitting, as Anna would say, just go out and sit for an hour every day in nature, is going to be a catalyst to unleash this awareness, or whatever you want to say. And that brought me to also Torben's thing at the very end, where he discusses his clump of birch, and which he planted, I think courtesy was given to him by his son 20 years ago. And he's watched this birch on a daily or weekly basis, or annual basis, develop, change, get white, start to exfoliate, just as birches do. And the meaningfulness of that experience. So putting that all together, I just think there's a connection here that is absolutely critical with nature, reconnecting with nature, that then leads to a trigger or catalyst to awaken. So that's what I really had to say for the moment. Brothers?
Thank you, Mike.
Yeah. I was in a rush to get here, and so I'm a little discombobulated. Philip, are you up for talking now, or shall I?
Or I can go now. In a way, what I have 2 pages of notes. As always, there's a great deal to say after these talks. This one, I think, was somehow for me particularly touching, because it came across with such humility and thoughtfulness, and it was essentially a dialogue, very handsomely orchestrated by Rob, between 2 people who are obviously extremely learned and sensitive in their subject. And I found myself slightly reminded of the way I feel when I go to a museum and there's an exhibition of some work or artist that I greatly admire. And I come out of it, on the one hand, inspired, and on the other hand, feeling no bigger than a peanut, because it's so overwhelming. And one is aware of one's profound ignorance. And that's not a bad thing. And this talk with the Finser brothers reminded me of my ignorance. And part of that, of course, is a subject that they addressed in the talk about learning and asking questions, and the way in which we hopefully, through questioning, evolve and discover our learning and going further on the path. Several ways to express that, but I think it was one of them spoke of nothingness and going from nothingness into metamorphosis. And of course, no metamorphosis it implies the esoteric, and as they referred to it, the notion of esoteric science, which of course also includes the exoteric. It's not an either or, it's a both and. And I think Steiner is particularly sensitive to that fact, and why he always defends science, because it's both and. It's not just esoteric and the material is of no consequence, which also brings us back to Anna Reitorth and what she had to say about the fakirs. Anyway, that's sort of perhaps I've said in my rambling way, the essence of how I felt about the talk, and what it wasn't like they were telling us new things in and of themselves, but it was situating Steiner in the context of those new things. And at the end of it, certainly for me, I said, oh boy, we have to have many more chats with these gentlemen.
Yeah.
And I think that's something to remember in all of our conversations. We want more conversations with each of these people because we're just opening the doorway. Anyway.
Good.
It's
good.
Terrific, Bob.
I like that image you left us with. We're just opening the doorway with the various people we're interviewing, including these two brothers. And I think everyone has been an expert with their own work as their own focus. So this was the first time where we took a man who people in general don't know too much about, and whose the depth of whose work very few people know a great deal about. So it was a different kind of situation that was more a true conversation, because there were three and not just two, and because the subject was absent, because he died in 1925. Well, I was very moved by it, and what brothers talked about as humility and yet great expertise, the humility and the humanity with which Steiner was exposed for all of us. Somehow they exemplified the man, is what my guess is.
Mm-hmm.
And what Philip said about learning as the essence of the human experience. We're not learning, we've checked out. But learning is on many levels and many moments. And so I'm not meaning that cynically. There were many things that struck me, and some minor things. Getting a grip on Steiner, for our listeners who, if they want to, well, this is interesting, let's find out a little more. The older brother, Tobin, what is his name?
Torben.
The older brother said, no, actually it was the younger brother, it was Mark. He said, if you want to get a grip on Steiner, who really was he and what were his fundamental structural thoughts. You read his books, and that's particularly good advice here because the man lectured for many days every year for 25 years, and he has 6,000 volumes. So he didn't write that many books. I don't know how many, but at least a dozen and maybe 18. And they gave us 2. For anyone who listens to the interview, they gave us 2 to start with.
Yeah.
I thought that was very helpful. I've struggled, I think, Philip, you have, with these lectures. There are a number of lectures covering very different esoteric subjects. So that was a clue that I found helpful. Otherwise, the core for me, and I think why I'm somewhat fascinated, he's not easy. He's just not easy. He does come out of the Western esoteric tradition. And Annie Besant was his cohort.
Yeah. They
overlapped. And then they eventually split, not he and Besant, but he played a role in theosophy centers in Germany. And eventually that role was dropped. But these 2 figures, the key to their splitting was Besant was devoted to the East, the occult traditions of the East, as well as perhaps the West. But Steiner felt, no, we're Westerners and we have a tradition. And I've grown up without being instructed, having access to this tradition, namely the invisible realm. And for a long time, Steiner was isolated, felt himself to be very isolated because there was no one he could talk to about this. And then I forget exactly why, but it was about 1900. He had experiences which gave him the confidence to start sharing. Mm-hmm. And so most of what we get in the way of written work from Steiner comes out of those last 25 years of his life, which was, those were electric years in science, in quantum science.
Yeah.
He knew it and he tracked it. I have yet to, because I've only begun reading them, I've yet to read where he on the page grapples with it, but he himself was trained in science. So the key takeaway for me, I think, maybe that's the wrong adjective, but the big takeaway is that we're at the abyss, the edge. We're in the abyss, and we're very alone.
Yeah,
and we don't know how to claw our way or dance our way or get out of it. This sense, all the methodologies, spiritual methodologies, and spiritual experiences and traditions that helped us in 1500 and 1000, so forth, all going way back, have to be eschewed now. I'm not 100% sure why he says that, but I think it's because science has become so overwhelming on the exoteric side, which is part of the whole, that we have to, as Mark said, rediscover our spiritual origins. We have to do the work in a new context. And I found that very compelling. Because we have to give up the gods and the oracles, they're no longer working for us, and the magi. What Philip cited, the metamorphoses, and Michael, you cited the going to the planting a tree or berry bush or whatever, planting, and then watching. So it is, to tie it back to how you let us open, Mikey, it is reconnection at this spiritually observant level.
Yeah.
And the handbook that says A, B, C, D and how you can do this isn't there.
Good.
Yeah.
Good.
I was reminded of Anna Reitort's distinction between meditation and contemplation.
Mm-hmm.
In listening back to my conversation with the Finsers, and I think to all three of your observations, maybe part of doing the work is simply showing up and being present and being,
Yep.
and that is so seems so antithetical in some ways to both the scientific materialist project and kind of the hurly-burly of our own moment here in the 21st century, but just to show up in contemplative space and to be aware and to be present.
Rob, one other quick little thing that I loved Mark saying about anthroposophy and how incredibly difficult it is for people to grasp and understand. But then he compared it. So what, he sort of says, I mean, it took yoga 1,000 years to finally be practiced.
Yeah.
So who knows?
A very good way to
Anthroposophy
think.
is the next thing.
We like that one.
Yeah.
Very positive reflection.
Yeah.
And also because of our three of us have a background with John Lash and the Gnostics. So we're used to this word. You don't drench yourself in the Gnostics, at least from the point of view of John Lash, without hearing the word anthropos a great deal, because it's a sacred word. And Sophia is a much more familiar word. So that's all it is, as Mark explained. Anthropos, Sophia.
Yeah. Very good.
Well, I look forward to much more.
Oh, absolutely.
About
absolutely.
Steiner, and who was really, you three know far more about him than I did rolling in here a few months ago when we started our conversations about him. So thanks to the three of you for the opportunity, and I hope we have the Finsers back.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Great.
Any last thoughts?
Nope. I think that covered things very nicely for the beginning.
The word, I'm not going to go into a rip. The word freedom and spirituality are intimately tied in Steiner's vision.
And that's maybe a good place to leave it, because perhaps we can pull on that thread in our next conversation. Well, gentlemen, thank you. Michael, Philip, and Ian Baldwin. And of course, special thanks to the Marian Institute for helping make this possible. And I look forward to our next conversation, gentlemen.
We do too.
Definitely. Take care.